There are few countries where the standard of minor morals is lower. Petty thefts, lying, cozening, every species of chicanery, drunkenness where the means exist, and idleness are characteristic failings of the Welsh. Morals are generally at a low ebb, and want of chastity is the giant sin of Wales. The whole people are kept back by their immoralities and low tone of principle. These are some of the quotes from the 1847 Blue Books, also known as the Reports of the Inquiry into the State of Education of Wales, written by an all-English Board of Commissioners. The release of the report marked a pivotal and significant moment in Welsh history. While its critique of Welsh education sparked a lot of controversy, it's the report's conclusions regarding the alleged immorality of the people, especially Welsh women, that provoked the greatest outrage. These stereotypes overshadowed the Welsh for decades, and they proved pretty difficult to shake. Without independence, political or otherwise, for centuries, Wales had been England's subordinate neighbour, subjected to an Anglo-centric narrative in history. As a result of this, Welsh women's history has been a topic that's been vastly neglected until the late 20th century. This lack of Wales and Welshness in history portrayed Wales as a backward and patriarchal nation, citing Kirsty Boata. But this wasn't the case. The social, cultural, political and economic situation of Wales differed from that of other regions. While North Wales remained vastly rural, the south changed rapidly during the second half of the 19th century with a rapidly expanding coal industry that brought new work opportunities and with it a lot of population distribution. In the 50 years prior to the Representation of the People Act of 1928, securing universal suffrage for over 21-year-olds, Welsh women's involvement in local politics proved significant. There are three major dimensions in which Welsh women were active prior to being granted the vote. Firstly, in participating in local government and elections, secondly, as full members on school boards, and lastly, as poor law guardians. These achievements were made thanks to the passing of legislation, making slight reforms towards gender equality in the public sphere. So in 1869, we have the Municipal Franchise Act, and this is where my research begins. So it gave the vote to some women ratepayers in local elections, but also enabled women to serve as poor law guardians. The following year, the 1870 Education Act allowed women to vote for the school boards, but also to be candidates to serve on these school boards. And lastly, the 1888 County Council Act also gave women the vote at county and borough council elections. However, they could not yet serve as members. This was granted in 1907 with the Qualification of Women County and Borough Councils Act. So many women across the whole of the United Kingdom, but for me in Wales, they saw these acts as a new opportunity to have a role in public life and local politics and to prove they were capable of public administration. So not much is yet known on their involvement in local politics in the 19th century, leading up to the suffrage movement. However, there is some evidence that has shown that women did gain some experience in political agitation as early as the 1830s with the Chartist movement, especially in the south, in the industrial towns of Cardiff, Swansea, Merthyr. However, prior to the 1870s, it appears that this engagement was pretty much in the background, and their male counterparts dominated the foreground. For example, in the Rebecca riots, this took place in Wales in 1839 to 1843, where farmers protested against the oppressive toll system. Men took the foreground, dressing up as women, depicted as Merched Beca, which in Welsh literally means Rebecca's daughters. And women acted as supporters indirectly from the sidelines, but they had the symbolic role. The figure of Rebecca, which is from the Bible, was symbolic of the female figurehead of community, and the use of a feminine name and attire was a way of making a political statement, though there was no actual Rebecca or woman at the forefront of these riots. So Ryland Wallace, a very important Welsh historian for my research, argues that the women's suffrage campaign did make its mark in Wales in the 70s and 80s, and often brought women into the political arena for the first time. And for my part, this is what I've come to learn. Of course, there are exceptions, but when we're talking about women in the masses, not your one-off political figure or Welsh heroine, this does appear to have been in the 70s. Some of the earliest advocates being, for example, Rosemary Crawshay. So she was the wife of Robert Crawshay, who was Wales's most prominent ironmaster. She became one of Wales's first female school boards in Merthyr in 1871, and she was a member of the London National Society for Women's Suffrage in the 70s. We have then also Gertrude Jenner, who appears alongside Rose to have been one of the first women in Wales to be actively involved in the call for women's suffrage in the 1870s, and she was a member of the Bristol and West of England Suffrage Society, and by 1876 she served as the honorary secretary for the Cardiff branch. She was later elected the second woman guardian in Wales for Cardiff in 1881 for the Poor Law Union, and she worked very closely with the mining community. She campaigned actively for political, legal and social justice. She worked to raise money for colliers following mining disasters, and she campaigned ceaselessly for improved wages and living conditions. In the census, it's fairly common that the occupation for women were left blank. But in 1881, Gertrude Jenner described herself as an honest working woman. However, considering her family's wealth and reputation, being born and raised here, this is Wenvo Castle, and her father was the High Sheriff of Glamorgan, so I think this statement can be taken with a pinch of salt. But as you've noticed, the two women I've just spoken about are from the upper class, and this was fairly common for the whole of the United Kingdom. These women had more time, more money, more resources to be actively involved in political movements, but I'll come back to this a bit later. So this brings me just to a few research questions. So how did local women's movement in Wales, such as those advocating for social reforms, as guardians or in the temperance movement, contribute to shaping the discourse on women's suffrage? How did the specific cultural and social landscape of Wales, including its industrial, rural and working class dynamics, affect women's participation in politics before the suffrage? And how does this compare with other parts of the UK? Were there many working class activists? If yes, more so than in England? And what makes the Welsh different? What types of opposition did the women face in their attempts to participate in local political spheres? And how did Welsh men and women, including political leaders, but also just the general public, how did they respond to this? And another question perhaps concerning longer term effects, but how did the political experience of Welsh women how did it shape their post-suffrage activism and their involvement in the interwar political landscape? So, like I mentioned, it's towards the end of the 20th century that we have some research on women's history in Wales, and it really starts to make its mark. Here are just a few of the major works. So Angela John, who is now retired but has been really a great support to me. So she's published, we've got Our Mother's Land and Rocking the Boat. These are a collection of essays that focus on specific women. So we're really looking at a more biographical perspective. One of the chapters in Our Mother's Land does focus on Rose Crawshay and the school boards. In Rocking the Boat, one of the chapters is on Dr. Frances Hogan, who was a Welsh doctor and the first British woman to have a doctorate in medicine. She also went on to write the biography of Lady Rhondda, who was a very prominent Welsh suffragette. But yeah, so we're looking at more biographical work. Then we have Ryland Wallace, who I just mentioned earlier. So the women's suffrage movement in Wales is a really complete, excellent, well-rounded work. And so for me, it'd be interesting to see how there are links between these women that he's mentioned in the suffrage movement that I hope and have already found in other aspects of political life, and maybe how this compares to England. In Organise, he looks at the 19th century reform agitation in Wales. There's only one chapter on women, but he looks at the early suffrage movement and the reaction to the Contagious Diseases Act. And then right at the bottom, it's not Welsh, but it's looking at a similar topic to mine, but of England. So women in local politics in England, same time period, very similar time period, 1865 to 1914. But she focuses solely on England. There's no chapter on Wales, and when Wales is mentioned, I think like 3 times, it's merged with England. There's no statistics or analysis that apply uniquely to Wales. So these work provide a fascinating insight into the lives of Welsh women, and a lot has been done on the suffrage movement and local politics in England. Little focus has been placed on women in Wales as a whole and how their involvement and participation was in their communities. And so in my research, I have focused on and continue to focus on and group together all the efforts of these Welsh women in local politics in this 50-year period, covering the 2 main areas, so in local government and elections, and secondly as poor law guardians. I did originally want a third dimension with the school boards, but it's turned out to be a lot there's a lot more than I thought originally, so cut that one out as it was not democratically elected. So when it comes to the archives, naturally the majority are in Wales. But I have visited some in Manchester and in London. So Welsh archives, as you can see, are scattered all around the Principality. So for example, we've got number 10 is the National Library of Wales at Aberystwyth, and it holds a variety of different documents from all across Wales. Others are county archives, so like number 1, you've got the Glamorgan Archives, and so they hold the documents for the county of Glamorgan, and others, for example, like the smaller municipal archives, like the Conwy Centre, so it's the Conwy Cultural Centre, that's number 15, and that holds documents for the small town of Conwy and its very near surroundings. So I visited all 18 locations on this map, along with the Women's Library at the LSC, and in Manchester there's the John Ryland Library, People's Museum, and the Manchester University Archives. So in London and Manchester, as you can imagine, the archives focus on the bigger, more national associations, so like the WSBU, the NUWSS, or archives linked to members of Parliament, for example. And in Wales, I've looked at minute books for the Poor Law Union, every single one, but every single union. It took me a very long time. But trying to track down every single woman who was a poor law guardian in this time. There's also the numerous reports of Welsh branches of societies and associations, so like the Women's Liberal Associations, the Welsh suffragist societies, the British Women's Temperance Associations, for example, and also papers linked to specific women. So, for example, the Gwenllian Morgan papers are held at Brecon Museum, so that's number 5. Gwenllian Morgan, she was Wales's first female mayor in 1910 in Brecon. She served, for 6 years before this, she served as a poor law guardian, and she was the daughter of a clergyman, and therefore, not therefore, but there were more, definitely, it was more common that she was a very strong temperance advocate, and she was founder and then held the role of honorary secretary of the Brecon branch of the Women's Temperance Association. She was also governor, a member of the school board, a strong liberal, the first female town councillor in Wales for Brecon in 1907, and then went on to mayor. Or there were the Florence Davis papers of the Aberdare Public Library, again in South Wales. She was a moderately middle-class member of the Women's Freedom League. She was also a member on the Education Committee at the Urban District Council, and she was most famous for her labour activism. You can see here she's sat next to Keir Hardie. They had a very close relationship. And she also then went on to becoming one of Wales's first female magistrates and elected to the Glamorgan County Council, being the first woman elected to this council in 1925. So I've tried to find cross memberships of to identify the same women across different aspects of political life. Newspaper archives have also been really instrumental in this, as they did pretty much document absolutely everything. So I'm asking myself, who are these female activists? So many, like I've shown, come from the middle and upper classes, but there has been proof of working class involvement, not as much as I was hoping to find, but there is some nonetheless, and this is to be expected given Wales's vast working class population, and Wales is very proud to be such a working class area. And so some of these women were wives of politicians, wives of iron or coal merchants. Some were wives of ministers, teachers, nurses, innkeepers, etc. Some were even daughters of politicians. We've got Megan Lloyd George, who is the daughter of David Lloyd George. She was actually Wales's first female member of parliament for Anglesey in 1929. So I've compiled a database with every single woman that I've come across since the beginning of my research in 2022, and it looks a little bit like this, though this is a very condensed version. There are a lot more columns that wouldn't fit on the page. So you can see we've got first name, surname, date of birth, date of death, place of birth, place of political activity. So their activity, and then afterwards census information, in what political movements they were involved in. So for me, the big four are the suffrage movement, the temperance, Pole or Guardian, and local politics, and then sources. So far in this database, I have documented 2,649 women, and finding out more about these, especially the cross memberships, has been much more challenging than I expected. Not only are they, well, there's literally thousands of them, but Wales has the smallest range of surnames in the United Kingdom. I'm honestly willing to bet in the world at this point, because between the Williamses, the Griffithses, the Evanses, the Joneses, the Thomases, I come from a line of Thomases in Neath, so yeah. But it's been really difficult to distinguish the cross membership. For example, I have 213 Joneses, so that's like 10%. That's almost 10%. But 56 of whom I only have one first initial for the first name. And for all I know, this could be the father or the husband. So I do have to give up in some instances. And also 30 of whom, the Joneses, I don't have any first name at all. And so here, for example, these are my Anne Joneses. So yeah, you can imagine, it's like a needle in a haystack. And though Wales is small, you would think that, two Mrs. Joneses in Aberdeen, surely they're the same woman. No, yeah, I can't just, not possible to make that assumption. So anyway, what I have found among these 2,649 women is that 742 were in some way involved in the suffrage movement or supporters of the movement. This is the largest political movement by far in which women in Wales were politically active. 607 were Pole or Guardians, 242 were temperance workers, and I found that just over 10%, so 272, were active in one or more. So this, for example, could be that they were a member of a suffrage society and a Pole or Guardian, or that they were part of the temperance movement, but also a member of a women's liberal association. And there are some cross memberships that are much more common than others. So in the latter years of the 19th century, NUWSS membership went hand in hand with the Liberal Party. The Cardiff and District Suffrage Society was actually the biggest one outside of London. So it does show you that in Wales, though we're not talked about that much, we do have quite a big suffrage movement following in the Principality. However, the allegiances between the suffragist movement and the Liberal Party are tested from 1911, when we have the Election Fighting Fund, which is an electoral pact that that Mrs. Fawcett made with the Labour Party. And there is evidence of the Labour Party making significant advance in Wales, with many women joining the Women's Labour League from its inception in 1906. But this does require, one, a little more research, and two, more than 20 minutes. But what I have found is that 203 of these 2,000 women were Labour women. Hundreds of Liberals. I've not even attempted to try to count them yet. However, only 24 were active Tories, active Conservatives. And I think this says quite a lot about the Welsh political mindset, and this is still the case for today. The most recent general election, I think it was the 32 Welsh seats in Parliament, 27 were Welsh Labour, 4 were Plaid Cymru, 1 were the Welsh Lib Dems. No Conservative seats at all. So yeah, a little interesting. Anyway, so there are other stereotypes as well that are also expected and that my research supports when looking at these cross memberships and so on. For example, wives of ministers were almost, it's just almost a given that they were a supporter of the temperance movement. Politicians' wives were often members and often leaders of a branch of, for example, the Women's Liberal Association, if their husband was a Liberal politician, or the Primrose League, if they were Conservative. So this brings me to my final example. So we got Mrs. Sybil Thomas, who was the wife of a Liberal politician, D.A. Thomas, who was MP for Merthyr Tydfil in the south from 1888 to 1910. She was the long-term president. I think she was the only ever president of the Aberdare Women's Liberal Association. Aberdare is a borough of Merthyr Tydfil. And this is where the Merthyr Tydfil is the area where the coal mine industry just exploded in Wales. But she was also president of the Welsh Union of Women's Liberal Associations in the 1890s. So this was a group that they grouped together all the Welsh Liberal Associations under kind of one big umbrella. She was also a staunch suffragist. Her husband was a supporter of the cause, and her daughter, who I mentioned earlier, Angela John, wrote the biography. She became the most famous Welsh suffragette, Lady Rhondda. She's Margaret Mackworth. And Lady Rhondda is actually the woman who helped get women in the House of Lords. She was the pioneer behind that. So she started with the NUWSS, quickly then lent towards a more militant movement, being a member of the WSPU and the WFL, taking part in the tax boycott in 1911, and in 1913 she even acted as treasurer to Sylvia Pankhurst's East London Federation of the WSPU, showing her more socialist tendencies. So to conclude, this research into Welsh women's involvement in local politics before the universal suffrage reveals a much more complex and nuanced picture than has perhaps been acknowledged in the past. Through their roles as polar guardians or as political activists, women in Wales made significant contributions, washing away the negative stereotypes that followed them with the publication of the Blue Books and laid the groundwork for the suffrage movement. Ultimately, the political experiences of Welsh women provided a foundation for their suffrage and post-suffrage activism. Further research is still in progress to enrich my understanding of how these women navigated the political sphere in the decades leading up to their full participation in politics, and to see if the Welsh were actually unique and different to their English neighbours, which I hope we are. I'm still sure that we are, but yeah, fingers crossed. Thank you.